Well, apologies for the birds, they're a bit excited. It's early autumn. They're looking for nesting material. There's an election in the air, you know that, I know that. We've entered the phony election war period. The federal election has to be held by May 2022, obviously. That's the constitutional arrangements, just in case you're not aware. And it's the Prime Minister's prerogative to set the date. And obviously they're waiting to deliver the budget, which will have a lot of little, honey drops for the electorate. And then the proper, in inverted commas, campaign will begin. Now obviously, this, like all elections, is not a real election. Obviously you will, by law, be forced to go to the ballot place or postal ballot. At least you need to sign your name off. Whether you need to fill in the form or not, obviously, is a different matter because it's a secret vote. But what I'm interested in looking at today is the policies that none of the major political parties will be talking about. These are important policies which have a direct effect on the livelihoods, lifestyle and living standards of Australians and people around the world. But these are policies that you will never hear about, or you'll hear about them briefly. There's a very good reason, because real power in this society doesn't lie within the constitutional framework we have. It doesn't lie in the parliamentary system. Ultimately, it lies in that hands of that small section of society that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, and the 8% who have the disposable income to be part of the investment class in a private investment for private profit driven society. And that's the key, private investment for private profit. So you won't be hearing about nationalising this country's resources system. The good thing about this country's resources system is it's produced billionaires. But unfortunately, the Commonwealth has not trickled down to the common people. It seems to get stuck in the hands of legal corporate structures which ensure that even those that are able to amass billions of dollars don't pay any tax legally. And that's the key word, legally. We have a taxation system which basically relies on wage earners. Over almost 70% of every cent that goes into the Treasury, of the $500 billion that goes into the Treasury every year, almost 70% comes from pay-as-you-earn taxpayers. It doesn't come from the transnational corporations, it doesn't come from the billionaires, it comes from pay-as-you-earn taxpayers. 1/3 of corporations, large corporations, will be legally paying no tax this year. Another third will be paying voluntary taxation. So we actually won't see any debate regarding taxation reform. It's very simple. Because the debate begins about taxation reform and redistribution of wealth, which is supposedly created by the private investment class in the society, you'll find that every organ of the media, every major political organisation, every major social, cultural organisation will come against that type of policy. So you won't see the policy of nationalising this country's resources without compensation for the major players. Another policy you won't see being trotted out at this federal election is the demands or the requests, they weren't demands, of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which was hammered out at Uluru at 2017 by delegates from the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community. They had 3 requests. They weren't demands, they were simple requests. 1, that we acknowledge the past. 2, that we work towards the establishment of a framework for a national treaty. I'm not talking about some piss-weak treaty as we're seeing currently being hammered out in Victoria, but a treaty which encompasses all First Nations people. And obviously there are questions about compensation. But again, apart from a brief response here and there, you'll hear nothing about it. Now obviously, and rightly so, the mass media, mass communication, both in the private and public sector in this country, is focusing their efforts on the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. Now obviously, you and I know this is a war which has been fought out by the three major imperial powers on this planet, the United States of America, China, the Pretender, and Russia, the Little Pretender. Now this war should never have happened. There should have been a negotiated settlement between Russia and the Ukrainian authorities, but pushed by the United States government and to a lesser extent NATO, no moves were made for compromise, which left very little room for the Russian oligarchs who wanted to expand their imperial empire. So the Ukrainian people are now paying the price for that imperial war. It is an imperial war which is based on the monopolisation of resources. So they're paying a heavy, heavy price. You won't hear that debate. But you will hear and see the atrocities that are occurring in that war. Now unfortunately at the same time around the planet there are other disputes which are occurring. In Yemen, a war which has dragged on for almost a decade, we're seeing the Saudi Arabian government, with the full support of the United States government, are wreaking havoc in that civil conflict, taking sides. In Syria, the carnage continues. Almost 500,000 dead from a population of less than 12 million in the last 12 years. But, you know, we're tired of the mass media is tired of that little war. They're not interested. And most importantly of all, you won't hear any major debate from the major political parties regarding the atrocities which have occurred and occurring every day in West Papua. And West Papua was taken over by the Indonesians 60 years ago. It's been involved in a civil dispute, in a military dispute with the original inhabitants, who number less than 1 million. Over 500,000 have died during the last 60 years, directly and indirectly as the cause of that war. Currently, there is one Indonesian soldier based in West Papua for every 6 adults. West Papuans, could you imagine that? This is over almost 100,000. And the dilemma is that these troops are trained here in Queensland and the Northern Territory, the Indonesian troops. The more brutal elements, which use torture, are trained here. We support them with military equipment. We refuse to use the word West Papua in a parliamentary setting. And both major political parties, in order to acquiesce to the Indonesian authorities, have never and will never take up this humanitarian disaster which is occurring less than 70 kilometres. This is not in the Ukraine, this is not in Yemen, this is not in Syria, this is not in Myanmar, this is 70 kilometres from the Australian coastline, almost within our economic zone. But we won't hear about that. That's not a nice policy to discuss during this phony federal election campaign. It'll all be concentrated around about 30 marginal electorates in this country. Although there's over 150 House of Representatives electorates, the election will be won and lost in the marginal electorate. So the major political parties will go out there beating their drum, telling the locals what they're going to give them over the next 3 to 4 years. And the locals know. You don't have to honour any promise. There is no legal or constitutional requirement that anybody who's elected to Parliament honours any promise. None whatsoever. There are no elections, recallable elections, in between elections, to bring politicians to account who don't honour their promises, who go off the rails, or who change their political colours. That's the extraordinary thing. You go in as a Liberal, come out as United Australia Party representative, just by switching sides. And there's nothing your electorate can do for the next 3 years. No mechanism of recall. And there's no debate about having recallable elections. Because you see, representatives in a political framework which is dominated by two major political parties are only interested in pre-selection for those seats. And the safer the seat, the greater the battle for pre-selection to sit on your arse for the next 25 to 30 years and claim a nice superannuation entitlement. Let's not forget that our parliamentary brothers and sisters at the federal level have the best superannuation arrangements of any section of the Australian population. I'm sure all those women in their 50s and 60s who currently find themselves unemployable, who are battling the spectre of homelessness, would have loved the same superannuation arrangements. But no, there'll be no debate about rolling back the privatisation tsunami, which has put us in this situation of 25 million people. That's right, 25 million people living on a resource-rich continent. We can't even deal with the 1 million children living in poverty. When there is a minuscule disaster, which affects only a small percentage of the population, we can't even deal with that. Not just in terms of providing emergency support, but providing medium and long-term support. Within a few months, those people will be left to deal with their disaster on their own. People whose homes have been built on floodplains because of slack local government and state government regulations, which are more interested in seeing the private investment for private sector mob get ahead. So there'll be no real debate about disaster management, a national disaster recovery centre, debate about a universal basic income. Now, theoretically, we are the richest country on the planet. Forget about the average wage, because obviously that has been pushed down. But the ridiculous situation of us as a nation building our fortunes on stealing skilled migrants from developing and third world countries, allowing them to pay for their education, while we're not willing to educate our own citizens and permanent residents with these skills. Then there's the ridiculous situation where we import people on temporary work visas to do work which is non-unionised, part-time, poorly paid, and we see hundreds of thousands of them being exploited in a cash economy which is based on the private investment for private profit model. So we're not going to see any debate regarding removing these sham arrangements of making Uber workers, the so-called gig economy, the 19th century economy which has come back to haunt us, to give them the protection that permanent workers have. No, there'll be no debate about that, because Australia's economic recovery has been based on cheap, non-unionised labour and not educating people born in this country and people who've come to this country with skills. Then we've got the ridiculous situation of a migration program which has been halted because of COVID-19, which is basically based on, as I said before, stealing skilled migrants from third world countries. So there will be no discussion about how do we look after the needs of Australians who've been disenfranchised through these migration policies, which have obviously the people who take advantage of these migration policies, it's no fault of theirs. It's the fault of successive governments who've been manipulated and pushed by the corporate sector to destroy this country's trade union movement and swamp the country with cheap non-unionised labour. I mean, this is a country where it's illegal to have a strike outside a so-called enterprise bargaining agreement period. And after jumping through about 150 hoops, the Fair Work Commission can still ban that strike. And we talk about, workers in China not having the right to strike. Well, there's not much difference in terms of the right to strike between China and us. There'll be no discussion about a universal basic income to ensure that those people who've been left behind, who've been pushed aside, who find themselves in difficult economic situations, who face, a hand-to-mouth existence on a day-to-day basis. There'll be no discussion that there should be a universal basic income to ensure that all people living in this country have at least a starting gate standard of living. No. There'll be no discussion about introducing a 1% stock market turnover tax to raise $30 or $40 billion from a section of society that gets government, that's right, franking credits, that gets taxpayers' funds. Tax shareholders get money from the government for holding shares. Extraordinary, through franking credits. And we saw what happened at the last election when the Labor opposition attempted to introduce a minor reform to the franking credits scheme. I mean, the corporate sector went gaga and assisted the Federal Liberal National Party to be re-elected through the efforts of the disunited Australia Party. Now, what a load of garbage that particular political party is. Clive Palmer's attempts to maintain his coal-driven empire. One of the billionaires in this country who's made their money through resources, mainly through coal, is very concerned about the climate emergency, what it means for the coal industry. So why not use, a few $100 million in a campaign to destabilise the system, channel votes to the Liberal National Party, who have never really accepted the fact there is a climate emergency, although there are increasing levels of disasters and magnitudes of disasters caused by the natural world in this country. Now, this goes on and on. I could stand here for the next 28 hours and tell you all the legislation which will not be even brought up in any way. Important legislation, essential legislation to ensure that the Commonwealth is used for the common good. That the Commonwealth isn't squandered on a corporate sector which now does the work of the public sector. The public sector in this country has been reduced to the levels of basically handing out contracts to the private sector, whether it's aged care, and we've seen the disaster in the privatisation of the aged care industry, whether it's the health care, and we're seeing more and more and more privatisation of various aspects of public hospitals at the state level across the country. Radiology, pathology, ward staff, kitchen, the list goes on and on. And people wonder why they have to wait for years for essential elective surgery. Why the care can be so substandard in so many places, not because of the staff, but because of the lack of staff, the lack of equipment. If you want the same garbage to continue, and it is garbage, if you want to be seduced by a new car park in your area, or seduced by a sporting grant to your local soccer or cricket or football club, or you want, a new road or, swimming pool or something, well, this is the election for you. This is your election. But if you want some more substantial changes like a universal basic income, honouring the request made by the Uluru Statement from the Heart, increasing funding for private education, the using 1% of superannuation funds as seeding funding for collectives and cooperatives to create a third tier to the Australian economy, an economy which is dominated about 95% by the private sector, a small amount by the public sector, and hardly anything by the collective and cooperative sector. So I'm not telling you not to cast your ballot. Go and cast your ballot. It's your duty. It's your legal duty. And not voting is a criminal offence in this country. That's right, a criminal offence, which, you'll have to carry. It's a criminal offence. But obviously, It's not just about casting a ballot, it's about what you're going to do in between elections. It's about supporting candidates who are raising these ideas. And there will be candidates, independent candidates, raising these ideas. Why continue to vote for the same tired old ideologies which give us the same tired old predictable results when you do have an option to set a cat among the parliamentary pigeons? Because that's what it's all about. It's about our representatives at the state, local and federal level fearing the electorate more than they fear those who pull the parliamentary strings, the puppet masters, the 1% who own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, and the 8% who are part of the investment class. And that's the dilemma. That is the dilemma. Voting in this country is like signing a blank cheque. You wouldn't sign a blank cheque. You wouldn't give somebody access, your PIN numbers and access to your account on the basis of faith. And that's what it is. It's faith. At least, let's have a movement that's calling for elections, in between elections, to recall non-performing politicians. I'm sure then they will take more interest of the people who vote them into power than the political party which pre-selects them for these seats. And obviously public interest before corporate interests will not be running as a political party because the goalposts were changed a few months ago. You need now 1,500 members at the federal level to register as a federal political party, not 500. And that means most of the smaller political parties are now being disenfranchised, deregistered. Many have come together in conglomerations with, general policies in order to survive, but most have been removed. So don't be surprised that when you look at your ballot paper that the number of people or the choices you have are greatly limited. At least have a good look at the independents. I personally will most likely be running as an independent. I haven't made up my mind yet. There's a lot of hurdles which are put in the way of independents to stop them running. But at least look at the independents, look at their policies, and maybe, just maybe, some of them will have policies which are similar to public interest before corporate interests. And if you are interested in our ideas, I suggest you go to Public Interest Before Corporate Interest, pibci.net. You can join online, you can download the application form, you can send it in. There are many ways, but ultimately the type of society we live in depends on what we do in between the farce of casting a vote every 3 to 4 years.